Good evening. Welcome to this virtual conversation with Zephyr Teachout about her new book, Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. My name is Marcia Eli. I am the Executive Vice President of the Brooklyn Historical Society. And in this latest work, Zephyr Teachout gets into the ring to take on our country's largest and most powerful corporate monopolies, arguing that companies like Monsanto, Google, Facebook, and Amazon work against our democracy and against the creation of a fair and just society. Before I introduce Zephyr and her conversation partner, Federal Trade Commissioner Rohit Chopra, I have a few things to share with you. First of all, you are all invited to send in your questions throughout the program by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. For those interested in buying a copy of Break 'em Up, and I hope you do, we have partnered with the Community Bookstore on 7th Avenue in Brooklyn. And you can find a link to purchase that book through the Community Bookstore in the chat. Finally, I want to invite you to some of the virtual programs that Brooklyn Historical Society has coming down the pike. Next week, we'll welcome historian Rick Perlstein, who will be in conversation about his new book, Reaganland, with CNN legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. And we kick off a special program series that marks the centennial anniversary of when white women, but very important to note, not women of color, gained the right to vote. Titled Women and Power, 100 Years After the 19th Amendment, this multi-part series unpacks 5 facets of the gender, power, and equity gap that remain in play today. Body power, economic power, caretaking power, electoral power, and people power. So to find out more about these free programs and to register, just visit our website at brooklynhistory.org. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Zephyr Teachout is an attorney, political activist, and an antitrust and corruption expert. A rising star on the left, her campaign for New York State Attorney General in 2018 was endorsed by Bernie Sanders and the New York Times. Her new book is titled Break 'em Up, and it follows her earlier book, Corruption in America, From Benjamin Franklin's Snuff Box to Citizens United. Teachout sits on the board of directors of the Open Markets Institute and teaches law at Fordham University. Hi, Zephyr.
Hi, it is so wonderful to be here and to be back. I had a wonderful event at the Brooklyn Historical Society about 6 years ago with my last book, and I really enjoyed it and really look forward to tonight's discussion.
We've been waiting. So tonight, Zephyr will be in conversation with Rohit Chopra, who has had a very long and distinguished career in public service. Chopra is currently the Federal Trade Commissioner, and prior to that role, he served as Assistant Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an entity that he joined the Department of Treasury to launch following the passage of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. He later served as Special Advisor to the Secretary of Education and was a Senior Fellow at the Consumer Federation of America. Welcome, Rohit.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here.
So I am going to kick off this conversation with a very broad starter question. Why is it a problem for these mammoth companies to have a lot of power? I mean, why not simply chalk it up to the price we have to pay for the convenience of searching for anything we want on Google or buying anything we want on Amazon or staying in touch on Facebook?
Well, thanks for the question. The heart of, there's a few key arguments in my book, and the first one is a direct answer to your question, because I lay out the ways in which these extraordinarily concentrated industries and a handful of companies in each industry use their power to hurt workers, not just by depressing wages and benefits and taking money that would be going to workers, but is instead going to investors, but also by exercising a high level of granular control such that workers are often in a state of rational paranoia. One of the things I care a lot about is showing the way in which people facing these platforms in what look like really different situations, like chicken farmers facing Tyson, Uber drivers facing Uber, and Amazon sellers facing Amazon, are all governed essentially and squeezed by these big platform companies. That's one problem. But another is that they are starting to become so concentrated, especially in a handful of industries, that they're coming to govern us directly in a whole series of ways. It's a kind of a form of private government that's rising. And when I say that, I'm actually not saying anything that radical for most of American history. We understood until 1980 that there is a threat that comes from private concentrations of power where they become kind of mini governments, rival to a democratic government or coexisting with the democratic government. So that's a second problem. And to be explicit about it, there's a few different ways they do it. One is by pushing arbitration. Another is by directly governing the people under their control. And you have companies like Amazon with 800,000 employees, as well as control over sellers. And the other is the big money way, by spending an enormous amount of money on lobbying, on campaign contributions, on investing in research institutions. In the last 2 weeks, there were two big stories about Amazon in one case and Google in another, spending money funding major institutes whose job is to discuss whether or not these companies should be broken up, as well as think tanks. So there's concentrations of power are a threat to democracy. And I think this pandemic has made really clear so many of the, has revealed so much about our society, but has also made clear another real issue with these incredible consolidations of power, which is that they're incredibly fragile. And when you have real concentration in the medical device industry, in pharma, in ventilators, in masks, you basically end up relying on a few single points of failure. And that's actually a really dangerous and really fragile system when you allow for mass hospital mergers, something that I know some of you who are here tonight have been fighting against. It leads to the great bedshed and the lack of resilient system that we need for a thriving, healthy society and economy. So those are just some of the reasons. Something I care a lot about that I lay out in the book is the way in which concentration of power is also, may sound race neutral, but is not in fact race neutral, that mergers lead to a form of bleaching of power. Because you see the ways in which the ongoing merger wave since 1980 has really led to the decimation of Black-owned businesses. Think about funeral homes, think about insurance companies, think about Black-owned newspapers. Mergers have led instead to highly concentrated power, typically controlled by overwhelmingly white officers and directors. So these mergers are not race neutral. And especially right now when we're looking at some people thinking that this pandemic may wipe out 40 to 50% of Black-owned businesses at the same time as we're heavily funding, providing access to funds to some of the biggest businesses, and we see big tech with outsized profits. I think it's really important to talk about the political and community impacts of those kinds of mergers. Those are just a few of the issues. And I'm really excited to be here tonight with Commissioner Chopra for many reasons. But one is, I think that when I lay this out, depending on the audience, a lot of people may say, Yeah, that seems right to me. There are all these problems. That seems right. But what can we do about it? And what are the levers and what are the tools? And in fact, I actually think impotence is one of the biggest reasons there hasn't been as much political movement around this. My call in the book is to say, you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be an economist. You can see there's a problem with concentrated power. Go ahead and demand that we do something, build a movement, reintroduce anti-monopoly into our daily politics. But I think for people to do that, they have to understand that there are real levers of power. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Commissioner, is if you could just lay out, let's just start because of today's news about Biden and Harris. People are thinking about the next presidency. Lay out what a president can do of either party. What are the president's powers when it comes to either breaking up or dealing with abuses or stopping mergers? And then you're at the FTC. What in particular is the FTC's role, and what do you do there?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again for having me. I think you're right that people intuitively understand that some of the issues that they face, whether as a worker, whether as someone who's buying drugs, or whether someone who's trying to start a small business, they're increasingly realizing that there are these other forms of power and control. They're not people you vote for. They're people who have accumulated it, and in some cases can abuse that power, and that's where it crosses, and many times it breaks the law. So just to stage set for you, something happened around a century ago where there was kind of an enough is enough moment. And, the people through an election, actually the election of 1912, was very spirited in terms of what are we going to do about these big, powerful entities who are wielding lots of control. And one of the many pieces of the puzzle that was put together well before the New Deal even was the FTC. And that was really an agency that was supposed to be set up in order to crack down on unfair methods of competition. That was supposed to be wide-ranging with the knowledge that powerful actors, especially those in big business, have found new and creative ways to innovate, to block out competition, squeeze those who have less power, and essentially impose their own private taxes and regulation on the economy. And I think we've all heard how this went about, everything from railroads. There's all sorts of examples of it. But one thing that has really, in some ways, quite frightening was the FTC's first major industry investigation. And that was over the big meat packers. And when you read some of the reports of investigation that the FTC did, in some ways it's quite chilling when you show it to a farmer today who feels the same exact lack of power over their own destiny. They can't necessarily even decide what crops they grow. They need permission slips in terms of planting seeds. They just simply see how the system is controlled farm to table, and they're not really an independent entrepreneur or business. They're really just a cog in that wheel. And I think it laid the groundwork in that case of meat packers for the passage of new laws, new reforms. And in some ways, we are seeing some of the trends revert back. And many people talk about our second Gilded Age, and harder to break into sectors of the economy. Funding and venture capital just dry up when some of these big, powerful actors enter the scene. So part of it is about, to answer your question, Zephyr, stopping abuses of market power, stopping abuses of information asymmetry, protecting families and honest businesses. So the FTC It's an independent agency. It's not part of an Obama or Trump administration. It's governed by 5 individuals. No more than 3 can be of one party. And I have been fairly concerned about the FTC in recent history. I have seen now from the inside about concerns about lack of empirical rigor, a lot of action by hunch and intuition rather through real analysis, a little bit of a lack of vigor when it comes to enforcement remedies. In some cases, not even deposing corporate executives, but really giving the hammer, pounding the hammer on small lawbreakers. So, of course, all of government is a reflection of really what people are looking for. And I think we're at this precipice moment. Are we going to move to more rigor and vigor, or are we going to stay in a state which, in my view, missed some of the key parts of the subprime mortgage crisis, missed a lot of the consolidation, particularly in the healthcare and technology sectors, and missed countless other scandals too. And I think we are doing a reset right now on what does the future look like. So I'm happy to answer more questions, but it involves everything from industry investigations to rules to enforcement actions. And there's so much that can be done to really promote a vibrant economy rather than letting it rest on, in some ways, the sloth of monopoly.
Well, thank you for that great introduction. And many of you probably don't know this, but Commissioner Chopra has really made a name for himself as an extraordinary dissenter, and has written a series of very powerful dissents in his role at the FTC that remind me of, as a lawyer, of the powerful Supreme Court dissents of Brandeis 100 years ago. And what Commissioner Chopra has been doing is building a different possible path for what the FTC could do and could be. So I'm going to come back to you for just a second, and then I want to zoom back out and go to some big themes about how we should think about these policies more generally. But just as long as we're on the FTC, most people then don't feel like, well, this is great. You may be a great dissenter. I may agree with you, but how would I, as somebody who is in Brooklyn, mad about Spectrum, mad about the ways in which Amazon is charging sellers too much and treating warehouse workers too badly, mad about Bayer Monsanto, mad about pharma, and who really believes that we need a new agenda, how would I possibly intersect with you except just hope that there's more of you?
Well, I really believe that one of the things that I have seen, and in some ways when I reflected on your book, I think about 4 big categories, and many of them you talk about when I read your book. So one is conflicts of interest. Another is abusive contracts. And a third is, capture and corruption, the extent to which agencies do the bid, not of the public, but others. Another is abusive, capture and the bidding, not of the political power. You talk about a lot of that, and I think a lot about that as well. But ultimately, no matter what some of these market problems people are facing in the economy, it in many ways maps back to one of those 4 categories, and sometimes many of those categories. And the FTC, has a piece of a lot of it. So, what I'm seeing from those who really want to see more action and less talk is they're really filing complaints with the FTC and the state AGs. They're knocking on the doors of commissioners and state AGs, even virtually, to say, look, what Kool-Aid are you drinking there? Why aren't we seeing more action from you? And what are some of the assumptions that you're using to make some of these decisions? I'll give you an example. Right now, since the pandemic started, there's such a myriad of major problems that relate to the FTC, whether it's, some of the things you mentioned, shortages and problems in our supply chains, particularly in healthcare. So much going on when it comes to the shift to the digital world and the protection of data. The list is so long. But what was one of the things that the FTC has done since the pandemic started? It voted to propose a rule to remove the labels that tell us how to wash our clothes. It says machine wash, warm or cold. And why on earth would it be a priority during a pandemic to rip off the laundry labels of our clothes? And I think part of that is we, as citizens, have to always be, we know this from the origins of the founding fathers, we have to hold our government accountable and ask those questions and say, why aren't you acting? And what are these kind of other projects that you're working on? I actually think a key thing, Zephyr, is we're seeing our state attorneys general really start saying, I'm not going to wait for the federal government anymore. We're going to act on our own. We're going to start filing lawsuits, doing investigations. And so I feel that for citizens, we need to start all really remembering that it's not just about passing new laws. Sometimes it's using laws and knowing who those decision makers are and really asking them that they've got to take action. And I don't have a perfect answer for you, Zephyr, but part of it is we have to realize that we come from a tradition where holding government accountable is part of our jobs as citizens too.
Yeah, so you were speaking about how people get it, and I just want to tell everybody that we just released some new polling today that shows how much people get it. I was working with a group called Data for Progress, and we asked a series of pretty open-ended questions about, would you support banning major mergers of really big companies during this pandemic? About 60% of people said yes, but we also asked some open-ended questions about, do you support breaking up big telecom and cable companies? Do you support breaking up big ag and big tech because they become too powerful? And what was really striking is that a majority of Democrats and Republicans said yes to all of these questions, but the number of people who were opposed was really small. There's a big percentage who just say, I don't know, I don't know enough about it. But even without politicians out there talking about it, people on the ground know what's happening. I mean, I mentioned Spectrum, and I think it's an example that New Yorkers can relate to, is seeing the impact of waving through a merger on people's lives. You have the Charter Time Warner Cable merger go through, and after that, despite promises to the contrary, service is bad, prices are high, and we are in the midst of one of the longest, over 3 years of Spectrum workers striking just to get decent pay, decent benefits. And what I've talked to several of the workers on the strike line, and what they'll tell you is before the merger went through, they didn't always get what they wanted, but they had a negotiating role. They were listened to. You'd sit down and hammer it out. And after the merger, now you have Spectrum, this Goliath. They basically don't exist as far as Spectrum is concerned. Spectrum is quite willing to walk away and set the terms. And when the commissioner is talking about these private governments, that's what we're talking about, is spectrum being able to have a massive impact on our ability to connect, on children's ability to check into school, which has been a major issue, obviously during this pandemic, although it always is, on workers, on dignity. And they're basically playing this mini governing role. So that's an area where I think, even if you don't know all the particular agencies that can do something about it, the more people raise their voices, the more we're actually going to see get done. And the state AGs in New York is investigating big tech at this moment, which I'm very excited about. But I got to tell you, another thing you can do is say we need more funding for the antitrust divisions of the state AG's offices. Because even in a state like New York with a pretty substantial office, there's fewer people working in the antitrust division there than are working on any given day for any single one of these companies. So just recognizing the amount of power that we're talking about, and supporting local enforcers, supporting work at the state level. I tend to think that we should both be demanding greater enforcement and demanding new laws, and that those two work together, but that the big hurdle we have to get over is people's intimidation and sense that, like, well, I don't know what the relevant market is. This is a world for economists, not a world for me. And people don't have that same level of intimidation in other areas. Like, think about tax policy. If you say, I think the tax rate should go up, you typically don't feel like, oh, well, but I'm not a professional economist, so I have no business there. Or I have views that people should get paid $25 an hour. You don't think, well, I'm not a professional economist, so I have no business weighing in. One of the incredible, really dangerous and insidious parts of the Reagan Revolution and the last 40 years of anti-monopoly policy is that people have started to believe that they don't have any business demanding that these companies get taken on for their abusive practices or get broken up because they're not professional economists. This is almost like stealing the language, this very political language of anti-monopoly, or the Grangers who said down with monopoly, and taking it out of the political vocabulary. And right now, it's coming back in. People feel it, but not enough political leaders are talking about it.
Can I share one just quick response to that, which is that I really think that there is a bit of a reawakening about people's understanding of the role between society and business. So I think we have all been kind of spoon-fed this concept that all of the great things that we see and have are really just because of companies, investing and risking their money and innovating. And actually, I think what public opinion has been shifting, that people are learning actually a lot of what we have in our lives is the reflection of public investment. So for example, there's a great book by Mariana Mazzucato. One chapter of it is about all of the government paid inventions that really power the iPhone. GPS, even Siri, I think, is based in it. Pharmaceuticals, so much of the core of drug discovery is based on government patents. So much of telecommunications innovation was the result of government policies. Being able to enforce contracts, getting patents, having immunities, all of these things shape our lives. And telecommunications and the flow of information is so core to that. I really believe we would not have an Amazon, a Google, a Facebook, had there not been the antitrust actions against Microsoft. We would not have these companies had there not been, the actions against AT&T and Bell Labs, that after the Bell Labs patent vault was opened up, we saw a surge in innovation. And really, we know that the internet revolution was based on the concept of really low barriers to entry. Anyone can jump in, open access, open source, not that there's kind of a private internet that, you know, someone is in the middle of taking taxes out of and imposing regulations. But what's interesting, I think people are starting to see that, but I'll tell you, I am not an attorney. I actually went to business school, and I worked at a global consulting firm that is quite infamous, McKinsey. And one of the things that I feel is just ingrained in everyone who is trained in business or in consulting or these boardroom dynamics, it is first principles that, of course, you want to create a business that can dominate, that you can create barriers to entry, that you can block out competitors, because that's the way you're going to be able to really deliver big for your stockholders and for yourself. And in some ways, business training is inherently in conflict with the public goal of competition. Obviously, we as the public want a lot of competition. We want the rivalry. We know that, sure, government will provide certain goods and services in our lives, you know, roads, things like that. But most of what is provided is through private enterprise. And the more that it is competitive, the more that we see lots and lots of great new stuff. And, you know, the thing I worry about is when sectors of the economy are getting harder to break into, that just means less competitive intensity across the board. So, you know, I sometimes can't even fathom what anti-competitive practices, the innovation that they kill off, the life-saving drugs that have been killed off. I mean, I feel we have lost so much richness because of some of the posture that we've taken. And that to me is really fundamental, is that individual business people, of course, they don't want competition. There's a famous quote, by Peter Thiel, competition is for losers. But we as the public, of course we want that, because we want to be able to bargain against as many people as possible, have the most choices. If we as an employee are being mistreated, we can work someplace else. If we as a cable subscriber are being ripped off, we can go someplace else. That's the idea of a competitive marketplace. And it really can be just lead to incredible progress. And, that's definitely at risk. There's a lot of people right now who want to see us.
Now you have frozen for me. I can't tell if I'm frozen or you are frozen. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, we lost. Okay. Can you hear me still? Okay, I'm going to take the moment of the commissioner being frozen out to sort of respond to some of the things that he's saying, because I agree with him and frame them somewhat differently. I think that decentralization of power is really essential. Or if you were going to have centralized power, and these are some basic principles that I lay out, if you're going to have centralized power, then it should be treated like a public utility. Like if we decide as a society that we want great concentrations of power, we shouldn't allow it to be discriminatory and use its choke point role to choke off new businesses. One of the things that I think the commissioner may have been referring to is the extraordinary investigation by the antitrust subcommittee of the judiciary, and we had this hearing 2 weeks ago, where you hear story after story of the ways in which these big tech, and big tech is by no means the only anti-monopoly issue here, would see potential rivals, and then have one of three different strategies towards those rivals. Basically, you either acquire them, and that's the story with Instagram. And Zuckerberg said some pretty incriminating things in that hearing, I thought, about his motivations in acquiring a potential rival in order to stop it from being a rival. So acquire, copy, and there's evidence that all of these tech giants use their position at the top of this choke point position to survey and gather data and learn about competitive products and copy them. So acquire, copy, or kill. And kill is when you see something like evidence that Google takes a rival like Yelp and buries it far off in search results and promotes its own search results. So you have these three different strategies to choke off potential competitors. And this is what all Greek myths are made of, is the king, the incumbent, doing everything he can to make sure that that child does not grow up to challenge his power. But the other thing that Rohit said that I want to just suggest a different way of thinking about this is an old way of understanding monopoly. And when I use the word monopoly, I use it in the sense of a company that can set the terms, that is no longer in engagement, but can just decide, this is the price of the drug. These are the wages we'll set. We're sitting on top of a market instead of being in it. And you don't need to be just one to be a monopoly. But there's the old idea that monopoly is a form of theft. And I think that takes people a minute to understand why. Like, why would monopoly be theft? In fact, the Sherman Act has criminal provisions, not just civil provisions. And maybe a way to illustrate it is what we've learned about Amazon and Amazon sellers, but this applies to many different industries. What you see is that 30%, there's a recent report by the Institute of Local Self-Reliance that shows this, 30% of every dollar you spend on Amazon, on average, goes to Amazon and not the seller. So that's a pretty big amount. Rohit suggested that sometimes people talk about these as private taxes. You know, basically, to be in Amazon's world, to be a seller on Amazon, you have to pay a 30% tax. But another way to think about it is this is and I like that framing, but the reason it's theft is that it is like a highway robber standing at the narrow point of the road saying, if you want to continue to pass through here, you have to pay your 30%. And I think that we can call on these moments in our history where we understood the deep immorality of allowing choke point companies to redistribute wealth upward and take it away from workers and purchasers. There's new recent evidence in Thomas Philippon's book that the mergers are also leading to increased prices. But I think it's dangerous to just sit with the consumer prices is the only way to think about this, which leads to my next question, which I think is just a core issue about what is anti-monopoly about, what is antitrust about. Since 1980, there has been a deep presumption that the purpose of anti-monopoly policy, antitrust laws, is to make sure that your toothpaste doesn't cost too much. That the job is to stop mergers that would lead to more expensive consumer goods, and to stop behavior that would lead to more expensive consumer goods. Now, I and many others in this burgeoning anti-monopoly movement, and it is a very exciting time to be an anti-monopolist, I have argued that this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work on its own terms, but more importantly, it doesn't capture the full reasons why we might not want concentrated power. So I would love you, Rohit, to talk both about how this is working in practice at the FTC and what you think another vision of what anti-monopoly policies goals could be?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things you mentioned was, um, a fixation on consumer prices. And of course, a good goal competition, of course, is we want, things. We don't want to be overcharged for things. I can now speak very personally. We don't want to be overcharged for lousy internet. I think we need to watch.
So speaking of lousy internet, I am yet again seeing a frozen commissioner. Am I alone in that, or can I see in the chat whether okay, he's frozen. All right. Well, I will take this moment to say, when it comes to providing great internet connections, we have different models. And I think a key, and I want to answer one of the questions in the chat before he comes back. One of the key things that I think I want to sort of shake people's shoulders about is being anti-monopoly is about breaking up excessive private power, but there's lots of ways to do that. It can mean breaking up by function, like saying, hey, Google, you can be Google, but you can't own Google Flights. You can't own a shopping service that competes with another shopping service. Oh, Amazon, you can be Amazon, but you can't also own warehouses. Just be the place where buyers and sellers come together, instead of using your place as the in the marketplace to leverage power in other areas. So one is separating by function. I think one way to think about it is like Glass-Steagall for tech, or Glass-Steagall for everything. John Deere, you can be a tractor company, but you shouldn't also be in financing, because there's a way you can leverage your power in one area to gain too much control over farmers in another. That's one kind of breaking up. A second kind of breaking up, and I think that's really important, because sometimes people think, oh, well, if we break up Amazon, then I'll no longer get same-day delivery, which is next-day delivery, which just isn't true. Another way is breaking up across the same field. And I think in most industries, we can have a lot more decentralization than we have. You don't need one big giant company. But in some areas, and I think this is especially true in tech, what we might say is, no, we actually do want the benefits of the network effect, but let's have it be regulated like a utility. But you could also say, like, hey, New York City, we want to have municipal Wi-Fi, and we want to take those amazing skilled Spectrum technicians who are on strike, make sure they're well paid, and decide as a city, this is a public good we want to provide. That's a form of breaking up too, because it's breaking up the thing that is illegitimate, which is illegitimate, concentrated private power. And so that there's all these different strategies. The key is, what you don't allow is a company to become big and governing, but then not either be a public utility or make it something that the city, state, or country does.
So I have a different view of breaking up right now, obviously. But one of the things that I'll just say is, sometimes there's business models where two of the types of activities are in a conflict of interest. And we've dealt with that in communications. And maybe, Zephyr, I know you talked about that a bit in your book, about structural separations. Maybe you can share some of that.
I did end up talking a little bit about that while you were frozen. What's wonderful is we have different forms of Commissioner Chopra, representing perhaps the ways in which our modern way of thinking about anti-monopoly since 1980 is, you're a consumer here, and you're a worker here, and you're a citizen here, and what we need to do is join them all together in one non-frozen person. I'm going to take the minute, because we only have about 15 more minutes, to answer an early question that I care so much about. which is, given how problematic Facebook is, why are these programs broadcast on Facebook? So I will refer you to a chapter in my book, chapter 9, which is titled, No, You Don't Have to Quit Facebook. And I actually think this is really important, is that we should not demand that people check out of these monopolistic companies in order to demand political change. And in fact, when a company has become so concentrated and has its octopus tentacles in so many arenas, it's actually really hard to boycott it unless you happen to have a lot of resources. So for most people, if you are running a political campaign, you can't boycott Facebook. If you are trying to look for a job, which many people are right now, making those connections through social media is really important. If you are a news source, a news industry, you can reach people through Facebook. And Facebook is maybe advertising right next to the incredible hard work that your reporters have done. But if you want to get those stories about construction accidents out there, then you actually have to go to Facebook. So we have to recognize that these are the communications infrastructure. And the way that I think sometimes progressives think is they say, well, before I can politically object, I should quit. I think that there can be, I think it's fine if people don't want to use Facebook or don't want to use Google. By the way, they're not going to stop using you and tracking you. But I do think it's important that we change the sequencing of our political action. So if you hear about Amazon treating warehouse workers badly, I think a lot of people's first instinct is to say, oh, well, I'll stop using Amazon, instead of, oh, well, I'll call Chuck Schumer because, well, he said he supported an anti-monopoly policy. He hasn't been talking about it a lot, and he didn't include big tech. And I'm here in New York, and we should be taking on Amazon, which is taking out the heart of many of these really independent bookstores. So I think we should switch our sequencing to be political first, and then our personal choices second. And I want to reach people with these ideas. This book is sold on Amazon. If you can, it's great to get it at your local bookstore. And for here, please get it at the community bookstore. But I want to reach as many people as possible. So in fact, the fact that they are monopolies is why they are so hard to boycott. Once you have a more decentralized economy, boycott actually works a lot better. If you have 20 different companies making cereal, and one of them is deforesting the Amazon, speaking of Amazon, then a boycott can actually affect their behavior. But when you have basically 2 or 3, the company can shrug and say nothing. So I really think that there's something really potentially insidious in a don't use these tools approach. The analogy I sometimes use is you don't have to stop sending your children to public school to be very politically active about different ways the public school could operate. You don't have to stop using school buses or public buses to complain about real problems with the bus routes. And you don't have to stop using seeds, food that is part of this totally concentrated ag market to complain about what Tyson is doing or what Monsanto is doing. And I actually think, just for those who are here, I think you can sometimes create these complicated chains of guilt. So an effective strategic boycott with political ends is really important. But the more that we start boycotting these companies to sort of beg them to change their practices, the more that we're kind of quietly accepting them as our governors, which they're not. And I think we should really, as speaking as a progressive, move from corporate accountability to corporate illegitimacy when it comes to these big companies.
So there's a question about agriculture resulting in cheap food that is less healthy. One of the things that I think we should be thinking about is what has big agriculture done to reshape a whole host of issues, racial justice, climate justice? The more that we are dependent on a few sources of food, that has ripple effects across society and the economy. It means that there's less biodiversity. It might mean that there's less control of our food supply in the time of shortages or disasters or emergencies. It might mean the undermining of rural communities that I think might even be contributing to opioid abuses. So I think the more that we see large firms extracting control and power, that the reduction in choice, the kind of chickenization that has been talked about, including in the book, the host of harms are so wide, while the benefits of competition can just be so great.
And this is where, I don't know if it's a difference, but I just want to call out a different way of thinking about this, is I think there's an incredible value in competition, but I don't put competition on a total pedestal. I put decentralized power as a more central value for me. And in fact, one of the things I really think it's important for all of us to be talking about is we know our current economy isn't working. It's leading to gross inequality, incredible amounts of suffering, and a lot of real depression as people are feeling humiliated, rationally paranoid, very precarious. We know this isn't working. So to me, the deep question is, what does a moral market look like? What does a moral economy look like? And I think sometimes when we talk about competition, we're still imagining a world where profit maximization is the goal. And that's not, for me, that is not actually the goal. I think decentralization of power is a greater value. So I want to live in a society where people can choose to be a farmer, and not just for an elite few, and say, I want to make a profit, but not maximize profits. And the analogy I sometimes use is a partnership or marriage. Is we, of course, understand that people, one of the reasons to have a partnership might be sexuality and sex. But if it became the only reason, if you became a sex maximizer, that would be a kind of really bizarre way of understanding what a relationship was. Well, that sounds crazy, but it's kind of what we've done with business. You can, in fact, many people go into business because they want to be creative, do something interesting, grow food, come up with a new idea. And they also do want to make a profit. And I don't think profit itself is a problem. I think profit maximization is a real danger, especially when it's combined with financialization and distant owners. So this is bigger than antitrust and antitrust agencies. But for me, I'm aiming towards moral markets where you can be a farmer, make a profit, but not be profit maximizing, always looking for whatever is cheaper. And that relates to monopolization, because the more you have centralized distant power, the more it tends to the radical form of profit maximization. But it's not just about monopolization. That is a different valence, a different way that I think about this. But for me, you can't have a moral economy with these Goliaths. Like that's an impossibility.
So Zephyr, when do you think it's good for the public to be providing kind of services, given that framework? Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I don't think I think this is the question. Like, when do you nationalize? When does the public do something? When do you have it be state run? And when do you have it be locally run? So the obvious answer is when a market does not arise and it's something that's really important, like great, high quality public education. That includes art, music, and sports. For all people. I don't think that's something that the market, any market structure, can provide in any kind of equitable way. And so it's really important that that be a deeply public project. That's one area. I think we typically think of, my first title for this book was who will grow the carrots or who will make the shoes. we typically think of things like carrots or shoes as something that should be provided and can be provided in a decentralized market. But the truth is there can be some circumstances where that's not true, where the state has to step in. So I don't think there's a simple rule, but if it's something that's really important to thriving, then I think the state has to step in. And for me, that includes healthcare, for instance. But one thing that I think is really important is if we're going to have nationalized health insurance or healthcare, that doesn't mean you can give up on decentralizing in the supplier sector. That you're still going to be dealing with pharmaceutical companies, even if you have Medicare for all. So sometimes I think people think, oh, if we have Medicare for all, we don't have to deal with market structure, but that's not true at all. And in fact, you've written some very powerful dissents in the pharmaceutical arena. Do you want to mention any of those, or what you're just to bring it from the meta back to what's happening now? What do you see happening in pharma?
Yes, so I really worry about pharmaceuticals and innovation. I think mergers can sometimes impede new drug discoveries. And the truth is, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the basis of these discoveries is in public patents and basic scientific research. So I think healthcare, and we have a question about what can be done at the local level, really thinking hard about consolidation of hospitals, physician practices. That can be, mayors and attorneys general at the state level can do a lot about that. And our healthcare, we can't it's not just about getting everyone insured, it's also making sure we can access it and it's affordable too.
Well, I want to take a version of that question because I think it's such an important one. And I know many of the Brooklyn Historical Society people are very politically active. So the question is, what can we do locally? And the big answer is make it part of all of your politics. When you're talking to your Congress member, your state senator, to Schumer and Gillibrand, make it part of your politics. But concretely, you can support public broadband in New York City. You can push against, and I mentioned this, but stopping these hospital mergers that have been really devastating for communities, or trying to roll back some of those hospital mergers, taking this pandemic moment. And then finally, you can say, you know what, Andrew Cuomo, you can raise taxes on the wealthiest so that we can provide grants to support our small businesses. And I say that right now because we are on the verge of small business catastrophe. And we sometimes think of these in two different worlds, supporting small businesses and anti-monopoly. These are in the same world. If we don't support small businesses, if we don't take on big companies, we are talking about a really terrifying transformation of the best parts of our city and state.
Can I just say, just to add on to that, I know we don't have much more time, but we're actually at a point where small businesses may go extinct. So many are failing at record rates. Disproportionately minority-owned businesses are struggling. Franchisees often are being abused. And I think this is a big moment about whether we want entrepreneurs and small businesses as part of our economy. And I don't want to live in a country where just they can't exist. So all of this is part of that. It is not just about making sure the big folks don't abuse their power. It's also about making sure we have the environment for entrepreneurs and small businesses to thrive.
So go be an anti-monopolist and demand that the city council take more action in this area, and demand that Schumer take more action in this area. But I really, I share both the excitement about the anti-monopoly moment we're in, with new people really coming together and really exciting coalitions of labor and small businesses who are increasingly realizing, we have the same enemy here. And the terrifying moment we're in, where we're looking at a mass wipeout of a decentralized economy that was already very concentrated. Thank you all so much for being here, for asking your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions. Please read the book. I wrote it because I care about it. And we didn't get to talk about all of it, but I believe that our democracy needs a revived anti-monopoly movement. And although the seeds are there, we're not there yet. But fight with me about it. Tell me what you think on Facebook or not. And I really, really want to thank Marcia and the Brooklyn Historical Society for putting on a wonderful series, for all of you for showing up, and especially for Commissioner Chopra for being present, talking about his experience, and being an incredible leader. Read his dissents, and you will get fired up with the possibility of what an enlivened FTC could do. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Thank you to all.